The city's din was a constant. Low-grade hum Alara could never fully shake, even in the quietest moments. But here, as her boots crunched on the gravel path leading to the cabin, the only sounds were the sigh of the wind through the ponderosa pines and the distant chatter of a creek. The cabin itself seemed to rise from the earth, its logs silvered by decades of sun and snow, the green moss on the north side a testament to seasons come and gone. Each summer of her childhood had been measured within these walls, the scent of pine sap and Grandpa's pipe tobacco forever etched into the very grain of the wood. She unlocked the heavy wooden door, and the familiar smell rushed out to greet her. A potent mix of cedar, old books, and the faint, clean scent of the lake. Stepping inside was like stepping into a living memory. There was the stone fireplace, where she'd toasted countless marshmallows. There was the worn leather armchair where Grandpa would read her stories, his voice a steady rumble. Her own additions, a stack of novels on the side table, a brightly colored woven blanket thrown over the sofa, blended seamlessly, a new generation of love layered upon the old. The HOA's monthly newsletter, waiting in the mailbox, felt like an intrusion from another world. She skimmed the minutes from the last meeting, her eyes glazing over at debates about uniform mailbox standards and approved mulch color. To her, it was meaningless noise. Her covenant was with the land itself, with the towering peak outside the window and the whisper of the forest. She paid the fees, a necessary tax for road upkeep and trash collection, but her spirit remained blissfully separate from the petty governance of Silver Pines. This cabin was her anchor, her sanctuary, and as far as Alara was concerned, the rules of men held little sway against the timeless peace of the mountain. The thunk of the axe hitting the block was a satisfying, solid sound, a rhythm that matched the beat of Alara's heart. With chips flew, smelling of clean, dry pine. This was her meditation. So when the purr of an engine that was far too smooth for the rugged gravel road cut through the mountain quiet, it felt like a violation. She straightened up, wiping a bead of sweat from her temple with the back of her glove, and watched the black SUV come to a precise stop just beyond her property line. The driver's door opened and out stepped Gavin Finch, the HOA president. He was dressed as if for a boardroom, not a forest, in khakis and a polo shirt embroidered with the Silver Pines logo. His smile was a little too wide, a little too fixed. The passenger door opened more slowly, and a woman in a sharp, cobalt blue blazer emerged, her high heels sinking slightly into the soft earth. She clutched a leather-bound clipboard, her eyes already assessing, calculating, scanning from the roof line to the tree cover. Alara, just the woman we wanted to see. Gavin's voice was a jarringly cheerful boom in the quiet clearing. He unlatched the gate without a second thought, a gesture that made Alara's jaw tighten. It was a simple latch, but it marked a boundary he seemed to believe didn't apply to him. Gavin, she said, her tone flat. She didn't lower the axe. This is Brenda from Summit Luxury Realty, he continued, gesturing to the woman who was now offering a professional, placating smile. We're giving her a tour of the most promising properties in Silver Pines, showing her the potential. Brenda stepped forward, her gaze flicking from Alara to the cabin behind her. You have a wonderful rustic canvas here, she said, her voice smooth. The setting is just spectacular. Alara's grip on the axe handle tightened until the wood groaned. My property isn't promising anything to anyone, Gavin, especially not for sale. The words came out cold and clear, hanging in the air between them. Gavin's smile tightened at the edges. Now, Alara, be reasonable. Let's not be sentimental. This lot is one of the largest. A new owner could build something magnificent here, something that would truly elevate the whole neighborhood's profile. It's for the greater good of Silver Pines. The phrase greater good landed like a slap. Alara looked from his polished face to the realtor's appraising eyes, and a cold fury began to burn away the initial shock. They weren't just looking at her cabin. They were looking straight through it, seeing only a future construction site. The silence after their departure was heavier than the axe in her hand. The gentle mountain sounds, the chirping birds, the rustling leaves, seemed to have fled, leaving only the echo of Gavin's words. The greater good. They echoed in the hollow space where her peace had been. She stood there for a long time, staring at the faint tire marks the SUV had left on her grass, each one a scar. The initial ice-cold shock began to thaw, replaced by a simmering, volcanic anger. It wasn't just the arrogance of showing up unannounced. It was the casual dismissal of her life, her history. Her cabin was a canvas? Her grandfather's legacy was sentimental? This was a declaration of war, wrapped in the polite, poisonous language of community improvement. She walked slowly back to the cabin, her boots making firm, deliberate prints in the soil. Inside, the familiar warmth felt different now. Not just comforting, but something to be defended. She went to the old sink and washed the grime from her hands, the cold water sharp on her skin. She looked out the window above the sink, at the aspen trees shimmering in the afternoon light. They had been saplings when her grandfather built this place. Her gaze then fell on the rickety toolshed tucked behind the cabin. A memory surfaced. Her grandfather, years ago, showing her a heavy, forged steel padlock. "For when you really need to keep something shut, Ellie," he'd said with a wink. She hadn't thought of it in years. Purpose solidified within her. This wouldn't be a shouting match. That's what Gavin would expect. No, her response would be quiet, physical, and unambiguous. She marched to the shed, the door groaning on its hinges. There, on a rusty nail, hung the lock, thick and formidable. Next to it, leaning against the wall, was a perfect, weathered plank of barn wood, saved for a future project she'd never defined. Now, she knew exactly what its purpose was. The plan, clear and defiant, clicked into place with the satisfying finality of a bolt sliding home. The barn wood was cool and rough under her fingertips, its surface etched with decades of sun and wind. Felt honest. Alara laid it across two sawhorses behind the cabin, the evening air growing chill around her. She didn't sketch the letters first. She wanted the message to be as raw and direct as her feelings. Dipping the brush into a can of forest green paint, she began. Each stroke was a catharsis. The bold, capital N of not was a barrier in itself. The phrase, "not to you, not to the HOA," flowed with the rhythm of her conviction. But when she painted, and especially not to Gavin, a small, fierce smile touched her lips. It was petty, perhaps, but it was true. This was personal. As the light faded, she finished the final line. "Now kindly respect my privacy." She stepped back, admiring her work. The uneven, hand-painted letters had a character no printed sign could ever possess. It was unapologetically hers. The next morning, with the sun just cresting Eagle's Peak, she carried the sign and a hammer to the gate. The new steel padlock gleamed, already a silent sentinel. She positioned the wood against the sturdy gatepost and drove the nails home with 3 sharp, decisive blows that echoed in the quiet valley. The sound felt like a period at the end of a sentence. The statement was complete. The lock was the law and the sign was the spirit. Let them try to ignore either. She stood for a moment, looking down the empty road, a sense of profound, defiant peace settling over her. The battle lines were drawn, not in paperwork, but in pine and paint. The certified letter arrived 2 days later, its official envelope stark against the pile of mundane mail. Alara's stomach tightened, but her resolve was solid. She opened it at the kitchen table, the same table where her grandfather had taught her to play chess. The language was cold and bureaucratic, citing Bylaw 14C regarding unauthorized structures and signage, and its potential to detract from the harmonious visual aesthetic of the community. It demanded removal of the inflammatory signage within 48 hours, with a fine of $50 per day for noncompliance. A hot flush of anger rose in her cheeks. Inflammatory, as if her plea for privacy was an act of arson. Harmonious aesthetic, as if harmony meant silent compliance with their greed. But the anger quickly cooled into strategy. Taking the sign down was not an option. That would be surrender. Instead, she did something Gavin Finch would never expect. She framed the letter. She found an old, simple frame in a closet, placed the HOA notice inside, and hung it on her porch wall, right next to the front door. It was a trophy, a testament to their overreach. Then, she took out her phone. She snapped a crisp photo of her barnwood sign on the gate, with the majestic, unsellable eagle's peak in the background. Then, she took a picture of the framed letter. She uploaded both to the Silver Pines Community Forum Facebook page, a group she rarely visited. Her caption was straightforward. Received this from the HOA after President Gavin Finch brought a realtor to my property without my knowledge or consent to discuss selling my home for the greater good. My grandfather built this cabin. It is not for sale. Apparently, stating that fact is a $50 a day offense. I just wanted my privacy respected. She hit post. Then she went back to splitting wood. The steady thwack of the axe a more satisfying response than any letter. By the time she returned to her phone an hour later, the post had exploded. Dozens of comments ranged from supportive outrage to a few criticizing her defiance. But the tide was turning. The local newspaper, the High Valley Gazette, had even commented, sent a DM, would like to talk more about this story. The war of words had begun, and Alara had just fired the first public shot. Gavin's response was as petty as it was predictable. The following week, Alara's mailbox sprouted a fresh crop of violation notices. Each was a masterpiece of nitpicking irrelevance. The grass in her meadow was deemed excessively tall per bylaw 8D. The beloved, moss-covered bear statue her grandfather had carved was now an unapproved external structure, violating bylaw 12F. The final straw was a citation for her cluster of bird feeders, accused of creating an attractive nuisance for wildlife. Alara read each notice with a sort of grim amusement. Instead of compliance, she met each with a creative and very public rebuttal. For the grass, she didn't just mow it. She used her weed whacker to carve a graceful, looping labyrinth pattern into the meadow, a design visible from the road. She posted a photo online, bylaw-compliant artistic expression. For the bear statue, she spent an afternoon sanding a small patch on its base and painting a neat plaque, historic folk art, installed circa 1998, grandfathered in. She then sent a formal letter to the HOA board, with a dated photograph of her grandfather beside the finished statue, requesting clarification on the definition of structure. The bird feeders, however, inspired her finest hour. She built a small, ornate, rooftop gazebo for them out of twigs and birch bark, complete with a tiny squirrel and finch cafe sign. A local news photographer, tipped off by a follower of the story, came and took a charming picture of the whimsical structure against the mountain backdrop. The image ran with the caption, HOA targets local wildlife cafe. The fines piled up in a ledger she kept more out of curiosity than concern. But with each creative act of defiance, her support swelled. The story was no longer just about a property dispute. It was about character versus conformity, and Alara was winning the narrative war without ever raising her voice. The flood of violation notices had become a grim ritual, but this time, Alara approached the task with a new determination. It was no longer just about defiance, it was about building a legal defense. If Gavin wanted to play by the rulebook, she would find a rulebook of her own. She needed proof that the bear statue was a long-standing fixture, something that predated Gavin's manicured version of the rules. She carried the heavy cardboard file box from the closet and set it on the kitchen table, the scent of old paper and dust filling the air. Inside were her grandfather's records, receipts for roofing materials from the 1970s, faded warranties for long-defunct appliances, and stacks of old photographs. Beneath a bundle of letters tied with string, her fingers brushed against a thick, yellowed envelope marked Deeds and Covenants. Her heart beat a little faster. She carefully slid out the contents. There was the formal property deed, but tucked behind it was a separate, single sheet of paper, its fold sharp from decades of being undisturbed. It was not typed like the deed, but handwritten in a firm, elegant script she recognized as the original developers, a man named Arthur Holloway. At the bottom, her grandfather's familiar, looping signature. Her eyes scanned the words, once, then twice, not quite believing what she was reading. It was a private covenant addendum, specifically granting Lot 14, her lot, a permanent exemption from any HOA regulations pertaining to the external appearance, landscaping, or placement of historical structures. It cited the cabin's unique heritage value and foundational status within Silver Pines. The signature was dated a full year before the general HOA bylaws were even formally established. The paper trembled in her hands. This wasn't just a loophole, it was a foundational truth. Gavin's entire campaign of harassment was not just bullying, it was fundamentally illegitimate. He had either been breathtakingly negligent in his review of the community's founding documents, or he had knowingly ignored this binding agreement. The quiet, weathered piece of paper in her hands was more powerful than any angry sign or creative protest. It was her grandfather, reaching across time, handing her the key to saving their home. The community hall was electric with a tense, buzzing energy. Every chair was filled and people lined the walls. Gavin Finch stood at the podium, his face flushed, attempting to project an air of wounded authority. He spoke of procedural integrity and the difficult decisions required for progress, painting Alara as a stubborn outlier threatening the community's collective future. The words were smooth, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the lectern. When Alara's turn came, the room fell utterly silent. She walked to the podium, a simple folder in her hand, her footsteps echoing in the hush. She did not look at Gavin. She looked at her neighbors, the faces of people she'd known for years, who loved this place as she did, even if they'd been momentarily swayed by promises of increased wealth. "My grandfather built his home here with his own hands," she began, her voice clear and carrying without being loud. She spoke not of bylaws, but of belonging. She described the scent of cut pine, the weight of a hammer, the legacy of love poured into every log. Then, she paused, letting the image of that legacy settle in the room. "I was told I was being sentimental, that I was violating the rules." She opened the folder. "But the only violation happening here is a violation of trust. And a violation of this." She held up the yellowed addendum, turning so all could see the elegant, handwritten script. "This is a private covenant between the original developer, Arthur Holloway, and my grandfather. It grants this property a permanent exemption from the very bylaws being used to harass me. It was signed before the HOA even existed." She turned her gaze directly to Gavin, who had gone pale. "The only one who has been breaking the rules of this community, Mr. Finch, is you. You either neglected your duty to understand our founding documents, or you knowingly ignored a legally binding agreement to force me out. Which was it?" The silence shattered into a roar of voices. Gavin stood frozen, his carefully constructed authority evaporating into the stunned, angry air. The battle was over. The truth, laid bare on a single sheet of old paper, had won. The roar in the community hall did not subside. It simply found a new target. A wave of outrage, fueled by a sense of collective betrayal, crashed over Gavin Finch. A man named Ben, whose family had owned their cabin since the 1980s, stood up and called for a vote of no confidence on the spot. The motion was seconded by 3 others before Gavin could even form a coherent sentence. The vote was not even close. Hands shot up, a forest of disapproval, and Gavin was unceremoniously removed from his position as president, effective immediately. The following days were a whirlwind of quiet, efficient action. The newly formed interim board, led by a chastened but determined Ben, held an emergency meeting. Their first order of business was a unanimous vote to rescind all fines levied against Alara. The second was to draft a formal letter of apology, acknowledging the board's grave error in pursuing actions contrary to the community's foundational covenants and the spirit of mutual respect. Alara found the letter in her mailbox, not certified this time, but placed there by hand. Felt different, felt final. She saw Gavin's SUV only once more, early one morning, speeding down the main road out of Silver Pines with a haste that suggested a permanent departure. Brenda from Summit Luxury Realty became a local punchline, her name synonymous with overreach. The energy in the valley shifted. The oppressive sense of being watched, of needing to measure the height of one's grass, simply vanished. Neighbors waved with genuine warmth again. The victory was not just Alara's. It was a reclaiming of the community's soul from the grip of speculative greed. The mountain, which had seemed to hold its breath during the conflict, seemed to exhale, its peace restored more profoundly than before. The siege was over. The autumn air was crisp as a freshly picked apple, carrying the smoky scent of wood stoves and the sweet decay of fallen leaves. Alara sat on her porch, a thick wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a steaming mug of tea cradled in her hands. The silence was no longer just an absence of noise. It was a presence, deep and content. It was the sound of peace earned. Her gaze drifted to the gate. The forest green letters on the barnwood sign had faded slightly, softened by weeks of sun and a few light rains. They no longer shouted their defiance. They now whispered a permanent truth. On a whim one afternoon, she had taken her brush and added a single word below the original message. Thank you. It was not for Gavin, but for the neighbors who had stood with her, for the truth that had prevailed, and for the grandfather whose foresight had protected her. The heavy padlock remained, but the gate itself was swung open, an invitation to the tranquility within, not a barrier against hostility. A young deer, barely spotted, stepped delicately through the opening and began to graze on the clover at the meadow's edge. Felt like a blessing. Down in the valley, she could see Ben, the new HOA president, puttering around his own woodpile. He waved, a slow, easy gesture, and she raised her mug in return. The community had found its balance again, its value once more measured in quiet mornings and shared history, not in square footage and potential listing prices. The mountain hummed its agreement, a low, steady vibration that seemed to seep up through the porch boards and into her very bones. The cabin stood solid behind her, not as a fortress, but as a home. And all was profoundly, perfectly right.